And tonight, one of my favorite topics, is car factories across Canada. Tonight, the topic is Toyota. Now, if you own a Toyota, you're certainly not alone. Toyota set a sales record in Canada last year with more than 238,000 Lexus and Toyota vehicles sold. That's third overall behind GM and Ford. The Toyota RAV4 was the best-selling passenger vehicle in Canada with more than 77,000 sold. Now, although Toyota is third in the sales race in Canada, it's the largest automotive manufacturer in our country. Toyota made more than 530,000 vehicles in Canada last year. That's more than double the number of Toyotas and Lexus that were sold in Canada. Most of the Toyotas and Lexus made in Canada were exported to the USA. In fact, about 82% of the production run went to the USA. Toyota has 3 plants in Canada employing a total of 8,500 people. Two plants are in Cambridge, Ontario. That's about 95 kilometers west of Toronto. I want to give you a brief outline of which each of them do. The South plant opened in 1988. This is where the Lexus RX 350, the RX 350H, and the 500H are produced. The North plant in Cambridge produces the Toyota RAV4, both gas and hybrid versions, and the Lexus NX 250, the NX 350, and the NX 350H. Now, the other plant is in Woodstock. That's about 50 kilometers southwest of Cambridge. That's where the RAV4 is also produced. Now, Toyota also has assembly plants in Mexico and the USA. There are plants in Kentucky, Indiana, Texas, and Mississippi, and a shared plant with Mazda in Alabama. And no, in this presentation, I will not be commenting or mentioning anything about the future of the auto industry in Canada, the industry in North America, or any other issues in the news these days. This presentation is historical information about why and how Toyota started making cars in Canada in the 1960s. Toyota was the new kid on the block in the 1960s. It was 61 years ago in 1964 when Toyotas were first sold in Canada. They had been sold in the USA since 1957. Now, this is an example of an early Toyota. This is a 1964 Toyota 700. It has a 700cc engine, that's 0.7 liters, and a 2-speed automatic transmission. The first Toyota assembled in North America was in 1969 in Sydney, Nova Scotia. Now, this is really a sneak peek at a later part of the presentation. There's a very long and winding road to get to making cars in Canada. And it's really a rather unlikely tale. A Canadian stereo and TV manufacturer and the man behind the Sobeys grocery store chain are the main reasons why Toyota came to Canada, specifically Sydney, Nova Scotia. First, some background information to set the scene and explain how and why Toyotas came to make cars in Sydney. What else was happening in Canada in 1964? Well, the first Tim Hortons restaurant opened. That was in Hamilton, Ontario. The Toronto Maple Leafs, with Tim Horton on defense, won the Stanley Cup. The Toronto Maple Leafs took the cup by beating Montreal and Detroit in the playoffs. And a resolution creating a new flag of Canada was passed in the House of Commons. That ended what had been called the Great Flag Debate, and there were plenty of other proposals of what the new Canadian flag should look like. Also in 1964, the Beatles performed in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, and the music of 1964 was indirectly a reason why Toyotas were produced in Canada. Here's the story. A unique manufacturer of stereos and TVs in Canada was Clairtone. The company started in the late 1950s. It combined very high-end sound quality along with very futuristic styling. Clairtone was also famous for its mini hi-fi radio. Now, some Clairtone stereos were very expensive, in fact, about the same price as a new car. Clairtone stereos were very popular. Owners included Sonny and Cher, Frankie Avalon, Tony Bennett, Frank Sinatra, and Oscar Peterson. And on our next slide, we see how Clairtone stereos were used in movies, including The Graduate and Marriage on the Rocks. The founders of Clairtone were Peter Monk and David Gilmore. Clairtone was a rather brash, bold, and brave Canadian business in the 1960s. Business was really booming. Sales went from $60,000 in 1958 to $11 million in 1965. Clairtone was ready to diversify and expand. And here's the connection to cars. In the 2008 book, The Art of Clairtone, The Making of a Design Icon, author and journalist Nina Monk, the daughter of the late Peter Monk, talks about her father's involvement in the auto industry. And she writes, just at the moment when Clairtone's hi-fi and TV business most needed his attention, my father was chasing the next big thing, the automotive industry. In 1964, when very few North Americans had ever seen a Japanese car, he and a brilliant Australian, Pat Samuel, had bought control of Canadian Motor Industries, CMI, whose one asset was the exclusive right to assemble and sell Toyota and Isuzu cars in Canada. Depending on your point of view, that deal, a complicated maneuver that resulted in Clairtone's and the Nova Scotia's government's brief ownership of CMI, is either A, an example of my father's farsightedness, or an example of his recklessness. Now, CMI was 51% owned by Clairtone. The new company was established in May of 64 in Toronto. The goal was to sell and later assemble Japanese cars in Canada. But before that, the first step was to import cars and sell them. And in 1964, the official announcement was made that the Toyota and Isuzu cars were coming to Canada with sales starting in February. Now, already at that time, there were rumors circulating that the plant would be built at Point Edward, Nova Scotia, at a naval facility that was about to be shut down. The president, Pat Samuel, was the former president of Volvo Canada. He would only say the location was undecided and that it may not even be in Atlantic Canada. And that's when the mayor of Vancouver wrote to CMI saying his city would be an ideal location for an assembly plant. Toyotas and Isuzus began arriving by ship in Vancouver in March of 65. On that first shipment, there were 217 vehicles. Here's an early advertisement for Canadian Motor Industries. It was at 2000 Eglinton Avenue East in Toronto, just east of Warden Avenue. Now, as well as the corporate offices for CMI, the facility was also the new corporate-owned dealership for Toyotas and Isuzus, Lorimer Moore Motors. This ad says the Toyota 700, that red car you saw earlier, is the world's lowest price car with automatic drive. And it says the Isuzu Bolette is for people who want sporting performance and luxury comfort at a budget price. The first franchised Toyota dealership in Canada was Bill's Toyota in Fort Erie, Ontario, right across from Buffalo, New York. The owner was Bill Pashinsky. He's standing right in front of the windshield at this early Toyota event. Bill told me that he first saw a display for Toyota at the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto. He was a 29-year-old mechanic and Texaco service station owner from Fort Erie, about 150 kilometers from Toronto. Paczynski had come from Hungary when he was 20 years old with dreams of owning his own car dealership. Bill approached GM, Ford, and Chrysler about getting a car dealership, but as he puts it, he couldn't even get past the secretary at the front desk to talk to anybody. But he says it was a different story with Toyota. He told me Toyota was doing anything to find anybody who had money to put down and were interested in the Toyota product. There was no franchise fee or anything. I got a $10,000 personal loan, and that bought me 5 cars that I lined up at my Texaco service station. I put an ad in the newspaper saying we had Japanese cars for sale. Well, I was the laughingstock and the village idiot for trying to sell Japanese cars. Bill sold his first car to a veterinarian at the Fort Erie racetrack. Toyota's fortunes, of course, later changed, and Bill puts it this way: I knew that sooner or later things would have to get going because the cars were far better than the Volkswagen or British cars. I had lots of faith in the product. It was just trying to convince the public. I always wanted to see the day when Toyota would be number one. I always said, one of these days, I'll have the last laugh. And he did, because in 2008, Toyota took over General Motors as the world's largest automobile producer. By the way, Bill's Toyota is still in operation in Fort Erie, and his sons now own and operate the business. That was just the start, though. There were soon dealerships across Canada, including Saunders and Hitchman in Victoria, BC. Other dealers included Stark's Motor Sales in Toronto and Gaines Autoland in Burlington, Ontario. By October of 65, CMI had 87 dealers across Canada. They had sold about 2,300 vehicles since cars first arrived from Japan in March. Shipments of vehicles from Japan to Vancouver increased. And here, on the next slide, we see shipments of Toyota Land Cruisers and Isuzu Bullets at the docks in Vancouver. As well, by this time, other Japanese automakers, including Nissan, then called Datsun, and Honda, were also starting to sell cars in Canada. Now, the next step, of course, for CMI was to assemble cars in Canada. And in 1965, it announced plans for a car factory in Nova Scotia. Here's how the Globe and Mail reported the news in March of 65. The parts would be shipped from Japan and assembled at Point Edward on Cape Breton Island near the city of Sydney. Cars were already being assembled in Nova Scotia by another automaker. Toyota was following an approach used by Volvo. We see here how parts were shipped in from Sweden and assembled in Canada. Volvo started making cars in Canada in 1963 in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. The president was D.W. Samuel, who left Volvo Canada within a year to become president of CMI. So Mr. Samuel certainly knew a thing or two about building cars in Atlantic Canada. And here's a look at the first Volvo that was made in Canada. It's now on display at the Nova Scotia Museum of Industry in Stellarton, Nova Scotia. Volvo later moved across the harbor to a larger plant in Halifax. Later, Volvo built an even larger plant in Halifax, and it operated until 1998. Now, for Toyota to build cars in Nova Scotia, the parts would arrive by ship from Japan in Vancouver and then be moved by rail all the way across Canada to Sydney. Then, we see the finished cars would be put on trains and distributed across Canada. This didn't make sense to the Vancouver mayor, Bill Rathie, who tried to get CMI to set up the plant in his city. As he put it, why would auto parts be shipped all the way across Canada to Nova Scotia to assemble when they could be assembled right at the Pacific port here in Vancouver? Maybe it makes sense to assemble Volvo cars from Sweden in Nova Scotia, but surely BC is the logical place for cars from Japan. Well, the reason was largely because of this man, Frank Sobey. And yes, the grocery store chain Sobeys was started by him and his father in Nova Scotia. Frank Sobey served as mayor of his hometown of Stellarton, Nova Scotia from 1937 to 1959. In the 1960s, Sobey was president of Industrial Estates Limited. That was the Crown Corporation set up by the government of Nova Scotia in 1957 with the goal of diversifying the economy, which was making a transition from mining. Sobey was also an early investor in Clairtone. Yes, that stereo and TV company I told you about earlier, the company that was the main owner of the Canadian Motor Industries, importer of Toyota and Isuzus. Now, speaking of Clairtone, here we have a look where by 1966, the firm was running into financial problems. So to cut costs, this stereo and TV maker decided to leave Toronto, population then 2.1 million, and move to Stellarton, Nova Scotia, population 5,000. Frank Sobey helped Clairtone get financial support from Industrial Estates that he headed up to open a plant in his hometown of Stellarton. Here in the picture, we see Monk and Gilmore with Clairtone looking at a model of the new plant, along with the Premier of Nova Scotia, Robert Stanfield, who later became the federal Conservative leader. The new plant opened in Stellarton in 1966, At its peak, there were 1,200 employees. More than half of the assembly line workers were women. Also in 1966, Frank Sobey helped Canadian Motor Industries make plans to set up an assembly plant in Nova Scotia. In July 66, CMI announced that work on its assembly plant would begin in September and would turn out about 1,000 vehicles annually. This is from the Globe and Mail in the summer of 66. The CMI assembly plant would be on the site of a former naval base in Point Edward, just outside Sydney. Here's how the plans were unveiled at a news conference in Toronto with company officials on hand. The plant would have about 50 employees to start. Like the Volvo deal, the government of Nova Scotia, through industrial estates, took part. A 120,000 square foot, $4 million plant would be built. Within 3 years, it was hoped there would be jobs for 500 to 1,000 hourly workers. The plan was to produce 10,000 cars a year. Now, at the time, this area had a high unemployment rate. The base pay was set at $1.95 an hour. That was more than double the minimum wage of 85 cents an hour. Now, we see here work on the plant soon quickly came to a halt in Sydney. CMI, with its aggressive growth plan, was running into financial difficulties. In December of 65, construction work was halted. Desmond Samuel resigned as president of CMI after just 1 year in the position, and the ownership of CMI changed with less Canadian control. Clairton's share went from 51% to 30%. 3 Japanese firms bought a controlling interest. Mitsu, a trading and financial company, increased its share from 14% to 30%. But here's the big significant new players. Toyota and Isuzu bought a combined 30% in this new Canadian company. Meanwhile, CMI's parent firm, Clairton, was also running into financial problems right at the same time. As Peter Monk's daughter Nina puts it, my father's short-lived ambition to become an automotive magnate hastened Clairton's downfall. There simply wasn't enough money or managerial talent to go around. I never worked as hard as I did that year, my father told me recently, referring to the period between mid-1966 and mid-1967 when Clairton, along with CMI, fell apart. Clairton went to the Nova Scotia government asking for money. The province said no. So the Clairton factory in Stellarton was shut down in 1971. The building sat empty for a while. It was later used as a mattress factory, then a Sears warehouse. Most recently, it was a cannabis facility. It closed 3 years ago, and the huge vacant building was still standing when I visited Stellarton last summer. Meanwhile, back to cars. With all the changes at CMI, there were delays in the opening of the assembly plant, and construction work didn't get going for almost a year, but finally the plant was ready to make cars. And here we see in December 1967, the first assembly line for Japanese cars in North America started turning out Isuzu Bolette sedans. There it is. In January 1968, a total of 80 Isuzu vehicles were assembled at the plant, and during the calendar year of 1968, a total of 584 cars were produced. From 1965 to 1969, a total of 3,145 Isuzu cars were sold in Canada. Just over 1/3 of them were made in Canada. However, Isuzus were not able to meet stricter safety and emission standards by both Canadian and American governments, so production of Isuzus ended in Canada after the 69 model year. With production of Isuzus halted, the Sydney assembly line then started making Toyotas. Here we are, the first Toyota made in North America. It's a Corolla produced in September of 1969. Initial production was set at 120 vehicles per month, with the hope of raising that so that a larger plant would have to eventually be built. By the way, these Canadian-made Corollas had one interesting difference from those made in Japan. Michael Poshinsky, whose father Bill had Canada's first Toyota dealership in Fort Erie, tells me that the Sydney-made Corollas Each had a nice Canadian maple leaf red and white decal on both front fenders under the word Corolla. That's how you can tell if a Corolla was actually made in Canada. Now, the assembly plant meant a huge boost to the local economy in Sydney, $6,000 a week, according to this clipping from the Cape Breton Post in November 1970. Meanwhile, right across Canada, more Toyotas were being sold and more dealers were opening up for business, like Enns Toyota in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. It opened in the spring of 1970. Here you can see the new Corollas on the lot, big rivals to the Volkswagen Beetle in those days. And by the way, that building that was the first Toyota dealership in Saskatoon is still standing. Today, it's a coffee shop. Also, years ago, Enns Toyota moved into a larger and more modern facility. Toyota was soon offering a wide range of models, importing everything from the basic Corolla sedan for $1,870, the Corona, the Mark II, the Crown, the 2000 GT, and the Land Cruiser, all while continuing to assemble a few Corollas in Nova Scotia. This period of immense growth was also a period of immense change for CMI. By late 1969, only 13 of the original 75 Toyota dealers that started 5 years earlier remained. Here we have a look at how dramatically Toyota sales grew in the late 1960s, from about 7,300 vehicles in 1968 up to 17,000 in 1969. And in this chart, the tall numbers under each year, the tall bar is the number of Toyotas sold in Canada. The little bar just beside it that you can hardly make out, that indicates how many Toyotas were actually assembled in Canada at Sydney, Nova Scotia. You can see how the production, 1970, 29,000 Toyotas sold in Canada, 938 assembled in Canada. In 1971, big year for Toyota, they moved to first place in sales among imports, beating out the Volkswagen Beetle, which had held the title for years and years. 52,000 vehicles sold, 1,000 a week being sold across Canada in 71, but only 1,300 produced. Production peaked in 1973 with 1,929 cars being produced, and then production as well as sales started dropping. Toyota said it was losing about $200 on each vehicle that was produced at the Nova Scotia plants. There were also some complaints about the quality of the cars from some dealerships. Unlike Volvos assembled in Canada, there was very little Canadian content on these Toyotas, and the Canadian and Nova Scotia governments were not satisfied with Toyota's contribution to the local economy. Then in July of 1975, it was announced the plant would be closing when existing parts were used up. In a statement, CMI said the plant had incurred substantial annual losses since it was established as what it then called a pilot project. It said the general downtrend in automobile sales throughout Canada, inflationary factors, and the deteriorating financial performance of the plant had reluctantly brought us to that decision. Government officials from Nova Scotia went to Japan to try to get the decision reversed, but it ultimately was shut down. In November of 75, production ended. 63 employees were out of work. In all, a total of 9,303 vehicles were made in Nova Scotia. The Toyotas made there accounted for about 3% of the total number of Toyota vehicles sold in Canada during the period the plant was in operation. That wasn't the end of making Toyotas in Canada, though. In the mid-1980s, Toyota announced it was going to build a new assembly plant in Canada. The province of Saskatchewan wanted to get in on the bidding war. Here's a clipping from the Saskatoon Star Phoenix in the summer of '85. The article says, Saskatchewan wants to get into the automobile industry and is vying with other provinces to become home to Toyota's first Canadian manufacturing plant. Okay, slight factual error there. We know now it would have been the second Toyota manufacturing plant because they already had one in Nova Scotia. The article also says an aide to Economic Development Minister Eric Berntsen confirms Saskatchewan will seek the plant. The article also speculates that British Columbia has emerged as an early contender. Now, it might seem odd, why would Saskatchewan bid on a car plant? Maybe not as far-fetched as you might think, because in the 1920s, when General Motors was expanding from Oshawa, it built an assembly plant in Regina, Saskatchewan, to serve the western part of the country. And that plant was shut down in the 30s, reopened, closed again during the war, and did not reopen. But the idea of making cars in Saskatchewan had been tried somewhat successfully earlier. That's why the province was interested in getting in on this new Toyota plant. Of course, we know the decision was eventually built, the new plant in Cambridge, Ontario. The official sod turning ceremony we see here was held in June of 1986. In this picture, it's the mayor of Cambridge, Claudette Miller, with the shovel, as well as local politicians and Toyota executives on hand. Toyota sales continued to increase. By 2008, Toyota overtook General Motors as the top-selling vehicle producer in the world. On display at the Cambridge facility is the very first vehicle made at the plant, this 1988 Toyota Corolla, one of 153 vehicles made at the plant that first year. And last year, the 11 millionth vehicle produced in Canada, this Toyota RAV4 hybrid, was part of a drive across Canada to mark Toyota's 60 years in Canada. Automotive journalists from across Canada were invited to drive one of the 6 stages of this 9,000-kilometer trek from St. John's, Newfoundland to Victoria, BC. I was driving the leg from Halifax to Montreal. The drive was really a way to share the stories of the people, facilities, and cars that are part of Toyota's 6 decades in Canada. There were stops at tourist attractions, Toyota dealerships, and Toyota manufacturing facilities. We just saw the time we stopped at Morrissey Toyota in Shawinigan, which opened in June of '65 as the first Toyota dealership in Quebec. It's still owned and operated by the same family. Here we see some other vintage Toyotas that were on display at various dealerships we visited. This was at Acadia Toyota in Moncton, New Brunswick, with a white 1988 Supra and a maroon 76 Celica. Among the other dealerships we stopped at was Levy Toyota, that opened in 1967 as Metivier Toyota, and it's still in the same location. On display, they had a 1969 like-new Corolla on display with a price tag when new of $1,798. Now, I don't know if this Corolla was made in Canada or not. I do not see that distinctive maple leaf flag decal on the front fender. So this one probably was made in Japan, or maybe if it was made in Canada, that decal is one thing that did not survive over the past 50 or so years. Now, on this drive, I arrived a few days early. I wanted to see the site in Sydney where the Toyota plant was once located. This is all that there is today. During the drive, I spoke with Stephen Beattie, the corporate secretary at Toyota Canada, shortly before his retirement. Beattie told me those humble beginnings here in St. John were an essential foundation for Toyota in Canada. He said you had to enter new markets and you had to understand what they were about. You had to build new vehicles that would meet the needs of the local markets, and Point Edward and CMI were sort of the proving grounds for that over time. However, Beattie says the distance was just too much to make the operation financially viable. He said, unfortunately, that plant was literally just too far away. You had to bring knockdown kits from Japan all the way across to Nova Scotia, and then from there distribute them back across Canada. It was a good plan of how to work with the Auto Pact and other regulatory requirements of the day, but ultimately it was just not a financially viable manufacturing operation. Now, Toyota is the largest vehicle manufacturer in Canada, with 3 assembly plants in Ontario, producing a total of more than 500,000 vehicles each year. That's certainly something no one imagined when a TV and stereo manufacturer, the Nova Scotia Business Development Agency, led by the man who had built the Sobeys grocery store empire, saw the first Toyota made in North America roll off the assembly line in Sydney, Nova Scotia in the fall of 1969. I would like to give thanks to the dealerships that I was able to visit during that drive. I would also like to thank Nova Scotia Archives, the Nova Scotia Museum of Industry, and most of all, I would like to thank the people at Toyota Canada who were most helpful in providing a lot of the details and a lot of the photographs in this presentation. So my thanks to Stephen Romerick and Danielle. Are there any questions?
Oh, thanks so much, Dale. That was excellent as always. Let me just put up your, I believe you have a slide with your contact information here. I guess as people are writing in, and a reminder, everybody use the Q&A tool and we'll address your questions as they come. Do we have a sense, when you look at, Toyota sort of entering new markets elsewhere, like Australia, it's often the trucks. You go to Australia, New Zealand, and everybody's driving Land Cruisers all of a sudden when Toyota shows up. I get the sense that Toyota trucks were never quite as influential in Canada. Did you run into anything? It always seems to be the small cars here.
Well, that's true, and they're probably best known for the Corollas. But I mean, one of the earlier cars they also brought in, or vehicles, was the Land Cruiser, and they have just reintroduced that name. And another early one in the 60s, as well as we saw the small Toyota 700, but they also had the Toyota Crown, which was a larger vehicle. And Toyota has also recently reintroduced the Crown name. So they have had larger vehicles. And also, we didn't touch on it here. They weren't made in Canada, but popular in the 70s were they called them the mini trucks, the small from Toyota and Nissan and Mazda. They all had these very small trucks. And of course, in more recent years, Toyota and Nissan and Honda have moved to full-size pickups. But I guess it depends what part of the country too, because I think in more rural areas, Toyota trucks have been popular and were popular in the early days.
Mm-hmm. Just going through some
But
questions.
because the Corollas were made in Canada, maybe they're more identifiable as a Canadian product.
Mm-hmm. Peter's asking, Peter, I'm gonna take your question and generalize it a bit. Do you know much about Isuzu in rally racing? Peter's asking if it wasn't Bellet, or didn't the Bellets do very well in the Canadian rally scene?
They did indeed. They were very successful, and that's sort of who they catered to. And I talked about how they were the production ended because they didn't meet the government regulations, and that's why production was switched over to Toyota. But it's also interesting that the Isuzu name, if that's familiar, even though that was the ones we saw were sort of the earliest Isuzus in Canada. That name reappeared in the 70s, and then in the 80s, General Motors bought a share of Isuzu, and the name came back on some products, and also some were rebadged as Chevrolets. And we last saw the Isuzu products leave Canada in about 2002.
Gonna combine a couple thematically related questions from Les and Mark. Do we know how many survivors from the plant are there? Like, do we know what happened to the first Canadian-made Bellet, or the last Canadian, or I guess Cape Breton-made Toyota?
No, we don't have any evidence of that, but that doesn't mean they're not out there somewhere. But in my research, I've not come across either of those first up vehicles. Whereas we did see the first Corolla in Cambridge, and I saw when I visited there recently and saw it. It's on display there, and that's good that they've been able to keep that one. But history changes, and maybe in '69 there wasn't that same sort of sense of history that there is now. I think now when the first vehicles come off, they're looked after, they're cared for.
I can, to a degree, Les, I can speak to your question a little bit. I have been looking for surviving Nova Scotia built Isuzus for going on a year and a half now for the museum's research. And I have seen social media evidence of one turning up in a scrapyard somewhere in California, I think, in it basically rusted away to nothing condition, and that's about it. They appear to be, I mean, they're built in tiny numbers, rare to begin with, and cars that would have been used in pretty rough conditions. Let me see here. Janice is asking, is there any evidence that Toyota saw or CMI in general saw sort of the failure of Studebaker and thought, oh, here's a market niche we could exploit? Was there a specific timing to this, or was it just that sales were doing well?
Sorry, the timing of Toyota coming to Canada?
Yeah, because it happens just as Studebaker is shutting down in Canada and Hamilton, and sort of there's no Canadian small car market anymore.
Right. I think it was more. I mean, the wheels started moving a little before Studebaker went out of business in March of '66. I mean, it comes pretty close, and of course, the rumors of Studebaker folding had been around for quite a while. But I would bet even if Studebaker had not run into problems and had not folded, Toyota and Isuzu still would have come to North America because we also saw around that time, 65, 66, Nissan and Honda also coming to North America, to Canada.
Another question, because one of the things that sort of shows up a lot is cultural reactions to the different ways Japanese manufacturers had of building cars. Was CMI, did it sort of have the vibe of a Japanese operation, or was this very much a sort of Canadian North American plant building Japanese cars?
Uh, Very much a Canadian company that had the right to build these Japanese cars, especially in the earliest days. And when you look at the early board of directors, it's while Claire Tone, Peter Monk, and David Gilmore were the main people there. They also, for example, hired away the fellow from Mr. Samuel, who had been with Volvo in Atlantic Canada, in Dartmouth and then Halifax. The rest of their board of directors is almost like a who's who of Canadian business leaders.
Mhm.
Frank McMahon, best known for McMahon Stadium, the head of IPSCO in Regina, Saskatchewan, and a number of other, 10 or 12 really top end business people. Although, as they say, the one problem, none of them had any experience in the automotive business, but they had a lot of experience in business in general. So, so they were, I think they were more, this is an investment project and we will create this product for the Canadian market rather than what we've seen more recently, where there's really a feeling of let's bring over the culture and have an understanding of what can plant workers in North America learn from the Japanese way of doing things, for example. I
Mhm.
don't think there was near as much of that in those days. It was more just a business plan.
Yeah. Do we know why CMI was formed in the first place? What spurred this idea of making a sort of holding company to make Japanese cars?
Well, I guess it was just a different approach when any new I mean, now you just think, well, why wouldn't the company just come and set it up? I mean, if you think of others like Mazda or Mitsubishi, some of the smaller Asian manufacturers that have come more recently, and of course also Hyundai and Kia and Genesis, it was a different time, and I guess partly it was such a new and different product that this was just seen as the approach of how to get in.
Hmm. I actually just by sheer coincidence was at Library and Archives Canada this morning and watched an interview with Frank McMahon at a dealership selling Toyota Crowns somewhere in Toronto, saying we're starting a company called Canadian Manufacturing Industries, or he seemed a little uncertain on the name. I think they hadn't finished the naming yet. But we're going to be making the Japanese cars here in Toronto, or possibly on the East Coast, or possibly on the West Coast. So it's a nice coincidence. Mark is asking if there's any sort of direct relation between the current day CAMI, Canadian Auto Manufacturing Industries, I believe, and the original CMI, or is that just a name coincidence?
Just a name coincidence. That the CMI of the 60s was a company that had the rights to first sell and then later build the Toyota and Isuzu, whereas the other organization represents, as I understand it, all the uh, auto manufacturers not based in North America, or not the derivatives of the big three, because Stellantis, you could say, is based in the Netherlands, but that's the holding company and so on. But I'm thinking of Chrysler, GM, and Ford using the old verbiage of the big three. And this other organization represents other automakers from other continents.
Uh, Phil and Peter are pointing out very rightly that the timing of this is probably to a degree affiliated with the launching of the Canada-US Auto Pact, that suddenly, there was a financial and a trade incentive for automakers to get a Canadian branch and get some of that sweet, sweet Auto Pact free trade funding.
Absolutely. And that's why Volvo was first off the mark with that. I mean, slightly before the pact had been signed in 65, but certainly it was coming that way. And they were very, very early adopters. I mean, even before the auto pact had been signed. But yeah, that certainly was a big reason why Volvo decided to set up shop in North America. And that plant in Dartmouth in 63 was the first uh, auto assembly plant in North America by a non-North American automaker since the Second World War. I mean, around the period of the First World War, before the Second World War, for a time there were Fiats assembled in the US, and also Rolls Royces, and also Austins. But all of those had ended by the 1930s. So Volvo in Dartmouth was a big deal as far as international automakers setting up shop in North America. And of course, now there's several of them, and I mentioned just some of the other Toyota plants in Kentucky, and the joint plant with Mazda in Alabama. And there's many others, of course, Mercedes, for example.
I think we're hitting a. I know we started a little bit late, but we're hitting a reasonable time. We don't want to keep anybody too much. So any final thoughts, Dale? Things you wish you knew more about, things you weren't able to find answers to questions?
Well, I would love to talk to some people who worked at that plant in Sydney, and I'm sure they would have some wonderful stories to share about what it was actually like in the opening days, meaning the Isuzus, the transformation to Toyotas, and ultimately when it shut down in 75. It would be great to hear some of those stories of people who actually worked in the plant. That's one thing I would love to find out. And it would also be great to see a Corolla with one of those decals on the side, on the fender behind the Corolla script, the
Yeah.
with the maple leaf, the red and white maple leaf. Isn't that an interesting idea? Putting maple leaves on Canadian-made products.